Today's story is called The Carole King Connection. The flight to LA was relatively smooth. My friend Steve Blodgett came along with me. Not only was he a good guitar player, but he was a great photographer and had started breeding dogs and was coming along to go to the dog shows in LA and to San Francisco. So he stayed at the house with Steve Jablecki and me for a couple of days before moving on. As we flew over the Grand Canyon, the pilot said, "Take a look out the window. It's the Grand Canyon." And we all looked and it was beautiful. And even swung around again so we could get a better look. Then later he said, "Okay, we're approaching Los Angeles." And everybody looked out the window and all we could see was an orange cloud. That was LA at the time, tons of smog. So Steve picked me up, he brought me out to his house in the valley, and everything was just as he told me. He had a beautiful house, a swimming pool in the backyard, all fenced in, converted two-car garage into the studio. Met the producers out there again, said hi, and we set about to get a band together. Everybody in LA who was trying to put something together from scratch went down to the Musicians Contact service. And for a small fee, you could register who you are and what you were looking for. So we said, we're looking for a drummer, we're looking for a bass player. In the meantime, we made a few stops at some of the studios to say hi and meet some people. And mostly people would meet receptionists who were beautiful young women that wanted to work in the music business. So Steve got quite a few phone numbers and they started coming out to the house while we were working on getting the band together. Well, word must have gotten around town that was some new kids in town, new guys on the block. And I don't know if they just showed up or we got a phone call, but one night, Charlie Larkey, who played bass, started in the Fugs in 1968 in the Village, and then was in a trio called The City with Danny Kuchmer and Carole King. And then he later married Carole. So knock on the door, it's Charlie Larkey and Danny Kuchmer. Danny was probably the hottest session musician in LA from 1970 to 1980. He had worked with Jackson Browne and the Eagles and Glenn Frey and Linda Ronstadt, James Taylor, a lot of people. He was a very famous guitar player. So, bing, bing, bing. "Hey, I'm Charlie. I'm Danny. We hear you guys are new in town. We brought over a gram of Coke and a fifth of Scotch. Let's get to know each other a little bit, and then let's play all night long." And we said, "That sounds great to us. How did you find out about us? And tell us a little about yourselves." So I asked Danny what he played. He said, "I'm a guitar player." I probably should have known that, but I didn't. And he sat down and he listed all of these people that he had worked with and all of the projects. Then Charlie spoke up and said, "I was in the Fugs in New York with Danny, and we moved out to LA in '68 and we started a trio with Carole." Now, Carole King broke into the music business when she was 15. And she became a staff writer at the Brill Building. Well, she wrote songs with Jerry Geffen like The Locomotion, So Charlie and Danny asked us a little about our background. Steve told them the Wadsworth Mansion story. I told them my story and mentioned that we had been trying to put a band together. And they said, how's that going? We said, well, the first drummer we got was a guy named Bobby Zamora, who had played with Reuben and the Jets. And they were discovered by Frank Zappa. So they had an album out, and Bobby was down on his luck because the band broke up, and he actually was cleaning drive-in movie theaters in the morning after the movie theater. And he said, yeah, sometimes I find money and this, that, and the other thing. And we found a guy named Skip Perkins. And we renamed him Skip Reefer Perkins because the first day he came out to jam, he said, hey, you got any reefer? So we called him Skip Reefer Perkins. As we got to talking, it turned out he was in the Navy with my friend Dave Hayes' brother, Gary. And they were stationed in Okinawa together. Now, you might remember from the Van Morrison connection, my old bass player, Dave Hayes, went on to play with Van Morrison. This is where we learned that Dave's brother, Gary, was best friends with our new bass player, Skip Perkins. Small world. They said, okay, so you got a bass player and you still have Bobby Zamora. And we said, no, the producers didn't really like the way he played rock. We had the studio time booked, and we found a guy named Dave Atwood, who was the first drummer for America, a horse with no name. So he rehearsed the songs with us. He sounded pretty good, and we were ready to go. So the studio time was booked. Meanwhile, we probed Charlie and Danny a little bit more about themselves. And we said, well, I said, Charlie, how did you meet Carol? And he said they had met in New York and they started a band together. They all moved out to LA to play in this trio together. And they made one album. Didn't really go anywhere, but James Taylor was an integral part of their scene, and they were all working together. And then Carol had recorded the Tapestry album. I think it still is the 75th biggest Billboard charting album of all time. It remained on the charts for 6 years. Almost everybody had a copy and loved so many of those songs. Charlie said, I got 2 kids, a boy and a girl. They're 2 and 4, I guess, at the time. So we exchanged all of this information, and finally they said, all right, where are we going to play? And we said, the practice hall is right out here. Steve had converted his garage, 2-car garage, into a rehearsal studio. So we got out there and Steve was on the piano, Charlie was playing bass, Danny and I were playing guitar. I don't recall who sat in on drums that night. But they were really revved up and they loved to play, consummate musicians. So they said, play us some of your songs. And we played about 35, 40 originals. And they jumped right in like they already knew them. And then we said, play us some of the songs you do with Carol. And we went through those. And then they said, how about some Beatles songs? What do you know by the Beatles? We played about 20, 30 Beatles songs because Jablecki knew a lot of Beatles songs. They said, okay, let's take a break after we had played for 2.5 hours. So Steve and I asked Charlie, how did you find out about us? And he said, one of the girls at one of the studios told me and gave me your phone number and address. I said, oh, well, that makes sense. Then Danny said, hey, tell us about yourselves. How long have you guys been playing? How long have you been together? And we talked and we told him. We said to Charlie and Danny, what was it like being in the Fugs in Greenwich Village in the 60s? They were a notorious group for just being totally avant-garde and off the wall. And it was very exciting that they had that history. While we explained to them the trials and tribulations we had been through at trying to put a band together, we told them that we found a guy through the contact service that seemed very promising. He was a drummer named Rob Roberti, and he had played with Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Bo Diddley and Gary U.S. Bonds, so we figured he had some chops and experience. But the studio was booked before we had time to have anything more than the preliminary audition. And that's where we were with the band the night Charlie and Danny came to visit. We were still putting it together. Now, we had decided we were going to call our new band Slingshot. Kind of like a rebound from the Wadsworth Mansion. You pulled it back. We started here, we were Wadsworth. We pulled it back, we're now in Hollywood, and we're going to spring forward and take over the world as Slingshot. Little did we know it wasn't going to be that easy. But we were young men, we were full of and vinegar, and we were ready to go. Nothing was going to stop us. And the visit by these two great players out to our place only encouraged us more. Charlie put out a couple of big lines of Coke, and they all had a couple of drinks, and we went back to playing. And they said, okay, you know any blues? And we played a bunch of blues. And then they said, well, what do you know by the Yardbirds? And we played everything we knew by the Yardbirds. And this went on all night until we ran out of the cocaine, which was about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. At that point, they had arrived about 9:30, so we had been at it, a long time, nearly all night. It was a very welcome to Hollywood experience, if you will. Here we were, brand new in town. There I was jamming with one of the best studio guitar players of the decade. We're playing with Carole King's husband, and we said, where's Carole? Why didn't she come? Charlie said, well, she's home with the kids. Okay. So it was an experience I'll never forget because those guys were so professional, and it just gave us an idea of what we had walked into. In LA, there might be 10,000 musicians competing for 50 jobs annually. So the competition was really, really tight, and everybody who was anybody had moved to LA. So we knew that we were in for a wild ride, a hell of a night, and it was just the first of many to come. And that is the story of the Carole King connection. There's going to be a lot more coming up. This is a short and brief little story because there are so many adventures to tell. So thanks for hanging with the old-time rock and roller. Thanks for keeping some love in your heart and always a song in your head. And I will see you next time down the Story Highway. So long, my friends.